Welcome, skeptics and truth seekers, to Schoolhouse Crock, the podcast that fearlessly exposes the real deal behind public education in the state of Colorado. I'm your host, Cecil, and on this show, we're not here to sugarcoat. We're here to unveil the truth, challenge the norms, and unpack the crock of you-know-what that often goes unnoticed in the realm of education. Today I have with me Amber Cecil and Devin Casteel. Amber Cecil, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, it will be a brief introduction. I am Amber Cecil, a Northern Colorado native and self-proclaimed mom-vocate or mom advocate.
We also have Devin Casteel today. Devin, can you please give us an introduction on yourself?
Devin Casteel, Stacy's husband, active duty Air Force and Columbine student in April of 1999.
Thank you. Today we are going to talk about school safety, and we hear on the news quite often right now about either a active shooting situation in schools or threats. We just had a threat kind of go out throughout the entire state of Colorado for bombs on school properties. And so we are going to talk about some of the situation, what's going on, what school districts can be doing, are doing, and what the real numbers of this is. Amber, I know that you pulled some information. Can you just give us some stats for school shootings?
I did, and when I actually pulled these, I got varying numbers depending on where I pulled them from. So I definitely noticed that, unfortunately, that the media, of course, is making the numbers seem a lot worse than they are. And please don't take this out of context, because I do not think that any shootings are ever good. So we don't want any of the numbers to be, we want it to be zero, of course. But depending on where I pulled it from, there were higher and lower numbers, because some of them included incidents that had a gun regardless of whether it was discharged, including accidental discharges, anything on school grounds, and whether or not someone was shot or harmed, and even when school was not in session or at night, during school breaks, things like that. So some of the numbers very swell. They were definitely misconstrued. So when I looked up the numbers on the National Education Association, that's where I started, because I figured that was probably a good place to start. That's a number that we're going to look at. According to Becky Pringle, which is the president of the NEA, there have been 288 school shootings between 2009 and 2018.
That's a lot.
That is a lot. The Washington Post states that 360,000 students have been exposed to gun violence since the Columbine shooting. That means that during a shooting situation, whether it's an active shooter or some kind of gun violence on school premises, with all of the students that are on site, they've been exposed to some kind of gun violence. When I actually sorted out all of the data, the raw data that was provided to me, 28 have occurred in Colorado since Columbine. But when I actually sorted just a little bit further, I pulled out any of the data that was actually just active shooters, and I was able to get 5. So there were 5 that were active shooters. 3 of those were determined to be premeditated. And then I was able to take out of those 28 that 8 of them were not on a school day, or they were at nighttime. So those could be completely eliminated from, not being exposed to children and that sort of thing.
Correct, yeah.
So 3 being premeditated, and I know those were very recent, excluding the Columbine occurrence, which was a premeditated occurrence that wasn't in the recent years.
Devin, can you tell us a little bit about Columbine, your experience, what you feel comfortable saying?
I think my biggest experience is learning that my safety is all dependent on me. And I think it's been proven the last couple times with the last couple Supreme Court cases that law enforcement doesn't have a requirement to protect people. And when I think of school shootings and look at security of the schools, there's obviously not enough. I think we have 4 resource officers or something for 5 for the entire district, with the district spending thousands on security. So I know it's been talked about in the past, using like veterans or something to protect schools, something better. but it's also a mental health issue when it comes down to it. So.
Exactly. I think that that's one of the things that we don't talk about enough is our elected officials. They're so quick to run and say that we need to put a ban on a gun or limit access or, 3-day waiting period for background checks, all these things. But not once have they stopped and said, what was going on in this child's life? I think, Amber, you'd mentioned how many of them had manifestos?
The manifestos weren't very specific, but there were 3 in Colorado specifically that they determined were premeditated or orchestrated, or they decided that they were going to do it ahead of time.
So that means there's some type of resources or documentation that implies we have a slight look into the mind of the terrorist, essentially. One of the things, I know that this wasn't executed at a school, but if you look at the Aurora Theater shooting, everything that James Holmes put into preparing and, documenting and what he was saying, we need to be looking at that aspect of it and trying to get an understanding of what was going on, what led to this point, because, there's always the thought that, the children are being bullied and that's why they're angry. That's what they want to do. Correct me if I'm wrong. Was that part of the motive that was able to be determined, I guess, in Columbine?
That was the excuse they used, along with video games and whatever.
Rap music. Marilyn Manson.
Well, exposure to things like that do desensitize you to, some of these elements. So I don't want to discredit some of that. That certainly can play a role in it. But if we are looking just specifically at school shootings and you want to talk about like premeditated and having a manifesto, if we just look at a recent one and we look at the Nashville shooting, when we look at that with Audrey Hale, the manifesto that was released and the information in that, it's very disturbing, the information that she left behind.
Well, I think one of the things that really sticks out the most is the rage. This girl was filled with anger and rage. We need to be looking at some of that.
And I wonder how much, her family said that they didn't realize that it was there, but that she had been under some kind of treatment for a mental disturbance. They believe that she had sold a gun, but didn't have any more in her possession. But in the end, she had 7 legally owned firearms. And so, not that I'm a proponent of red flag laws, because I'm not, but this is where those are supposed to come and work. And in this case, things like that fail. And I actually don't know if Tennessee has red flag law. I don't know if they do or not. I would have to look that up. But these are where things like that completely fail. And she had things on her social media. Well, after this happened, they completely scrubbed her social media and took everything down because they don't want people to see what was out there, because it's showing where people failed. The FBI knew, the police knew, people were reporting it to the school, people were reporting it, and everybody failed and nobody did anything, knowing that this was a possibility. Where are we not doing something?
Did any of the stats talk about pharmaceuticals?
They said she was being treated. They didn't actually discuss any medications or anything like that. But I know I've been on pharmaceuticals before to treat depression. And it took several different types of medicines before we found the right one, and different dosages and things before we found what worked. And I'm able to not be on anything now. Praise Jesus. I'm so glad that I don't have to be on those, because they did not make me feel like myself.
And to your point, Devin, the Columbine shooters, were they both on antidepressants?
I know Klebold was. I don't remember Harris.
I think that's one of the things. We talk about just antidepressants, but with both the Tennessee shooting and the Iowa shooting that happened last week, those specifically, people who identified as trans, and we know that when a child says that they identify as trans and, they're starting to push forward to that, there are pharmaceuticals involved in that. One of the biggest ones is Lupron. And Amber, I think you have a little experience with Lupron and kind of how that affects mentally for you.
I do. I've been on several different treatments. I actually have polycystic ovarian syndrome and endometriosis, which I've been treated for a number of years. One of the treatments that they put you on is, of course, birth control. That's the first treatment that they go for, which is, depending on which level they go for, it's a lot of hormones, progesterone and estrogen, sometimes even testosterone, depending on the type of birth control they're going for. And then when that doesn't work, in order to treat you for your endometriosis, essentially they put you in a chemical menopause, which is the Lupron. And Lupron has some horrific side effects that they don't tell you about. And in my case, it led to me not being able to conceive any further. So after having my child, I'm so grateful I was able to have my daughter. But going through some treatments later on in my life, we weren't able to conceive any more children because it's essentially made me infertile. But those kinds of things can really mess with you and your mental stability when, having to go through that at 34 years old, I couldn't imagine having to go through that at 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 years old. And some of these kids that are dealing with that, not understanding what's going on with their body, it messes with your mind. It made me obsessive compulsive. It made me feel uncomfortable in my own skin. It made me feel I had no sex drive. It was just bizarre. It made me feel bizarre. I don't know any other word to put to it.
I also had a polycystic ovarian syndrome as well as endometriosis. And at one point, it was kind of suggested that maybe I'd look into Lupron. And I remember because of the polycystic ovarian syndrome, I would have cysts on my ovaries, and then if they ruptured, it was excruciating. And so I had a cyst on my ovary after I had my son, and they were monitoring it, and we were doing an ultrasound on it. I remember the ultrasound tech said, whatever you do not get on Lupron. She's like, my family hated me when I was on there. She's like, I lost a good 4 years of my life with my family because I was so miserable because of the Lupron and what it did. And she said, I was so angry. So, if these kids are identifying as trans and maybe they are looking to do something like Lupron, it's no wonder, they may be feeling even more anger than just the regular confusion that they're currently experiencing if they are intentionally medicating themselves with a medication that can stoke anger.
Well, then I think about being on something like that and then maybe going to a therapist who's trying to counteract that and put you on something else like, I don't know, like a Zoloft or a Prozac or something like that to try and counteract what the Lupron or the hormone or whatever hormone blockers are doing to you. And it's just this mess of things that are happening, and oftentimes you're not checking in enough. And then something else that happens, and I've noticed this with a lot of people, and I have had family members who've done this, is they will start to feel better. They'll be on a drug and they'll start to feel better, which means it's working. That's great. So there are times that the drugs are working, and that's great. But they feel better and they're like, oh great, it's working. I don't need this anymore. So they come off of it. And then their body goes into disaster mode. It has no idea what to do. And that's when they spiral.
Yeah.
Creates a perfect storm of disaster.
So one of the things, that we can talk about is like what is currently in place right now, what requirements there are. I know the state of Texas as a whole tried to pass some legislation that, requires SRO and all of this stuff. The problem is, so we're told, that there's just not enough funding. But we run into issues like if you look at the Poudre School District, after George Floyd was killed, and we were as a nation, they were, crying to defund the police. The Poudre School District in Fort Collins, Colorado, decided to terminate their SRO program with the city of Fort Collins. And, they're trying to say, oh no, we don't want SROs, they're dangerous. But then we look a couple of years later, last March, we have that Denver East shooting where there's no SROs in the school. They have teachers patting down students to see if they're armed or anything when, teachers are not getting the training to do some of that stuff. So when there's a funding shortage, Devin, you'd mentioned retired veterans or, somebody to just come and help out. You would think that the districts would be open to that idea, but they're not. They want it to be law enforcement. The second option, but definitely not as preferred by districts, it would be armed security. So, we're really taking away from where we have a situation, we're creating a situation where we don't, quote unquote, have the funding for this, but yet we don't want to utilize some of the resources that we do have access to. Here in Greeley, we have 5 SROs for 22 schools. One of our schools does fall in unincorporated Weld County. The Weld County Sheriff, Sheriff Rames, has advised that because so much of Weld County is rural and the response time for law enforcement to get there would be way longer than what we really have in these moments.
An active shooter situation on average is like 5 to 7 minutes or something.
So yeah, there's none. Even if there was a shooting,
to be in and out.
If there was a shooting in Alt at the Highland School District, and then Eaton is the next town over, that could potentially send resources, right, to help. That's still a 5 to 7 minute time frame. He's realized this and he has allocated sheriff deputies for the schools to try to help. And so, I think that as a parent, that makes me feel a lot better to know that there's people there. Also here in Greeley, I know that they use a program that allows them to, it's an app on their phone, and it allows them to notify everybody that needs to be notified immediately of any type of a threat. And that takes away some of the phone tree of like, okay, now I have to call away, and did you call, Greeley Police Department or whatever. Like, this immediately sends notifications out to everybody that needs to be informed. And, that makes me feel better to know that there's some type of organization in that aspect. But I think that, we need to talk more. What is the answer? Is metal detectors the answer? Or is there a loop around with the metal detectors?
Well, I was looking at the SRO just information, and I couldn't pull out Colorado specifically because they didn't have a number just for Colorado alone. But through the National Association of Security, or for the resource officers, they have 24,900 SROs as of last year, so at the end of last year. So then I wanted to know...
Is that 2022 last year?
2022.
Okay.
They didn't have a number yet for 2023. It's still a little early to pull.
I assumed, yeah.
So, and that's just through this organization of SROs for the school resource officers. This wouldn't be for anything that's privately funded or hired directly through a school, maybe like me hiring their own security detail. So with that being said, I went ahead and pulled the number of public schools. And public and private schools, public and private schools, I believe is what this number was, 98,469.
Wow.
So if you pull those out, this was public schools and public charter schools.
Okay.
So these are things that are publicly funded, 98,469. There was a little grouping that they considered to be other, and it wasn't a huge number, but there was a group that was other. This meant that there was 0.25, if you divide it out, 0.25 SROs per school. So not even a quarter of a person available to each school.
Which the math adds up in that, because here in Greeley,
That's about,
if you have 5 and there's 22, I mean, there's
right.
about
So it's about the same average. They do say that there were, as of 2015 and 2016 school year, there were 52,000 plus another 15,500 sworn law enforcement officers that would at least be in the schools for at least one day a week.
So, with your professional opinion, Devin, do you think that the armed SROs on campus is the answer? And the reason I ask this is I saw on X last week a lady here in Colorado had tweeted out after, or whatever it's called now.
I don't think it's called tweeting.
After the shooting in Iowa, that armed security is not the answer because Columbine had an armed security guard. So what do you think? Do you think that's not the answer? Or do you think that there's more factors to why the armed security guard in Columbine was not effective?
Columbine changed the way the entire world responded to active shooters. When that happened, they sat outside waiting for SWAT to get there. Now, response is, as soon as you hear gunshots, whether it's one person or multiple, you go to get the gun. I think I said the average active shooter situations like 5 to 7 minutes. With a gun in there, they're usually done within 3 to 4 minutes. And obviously, depending on the skills it takes for somebody to take them out. So yes, a gun in every situation.
Well, and so then because obviously when I read her tweet, then I was like asking you, because you are pretty much my bounce off person where I ask any questions that I might have too. And I started looking into it a little bit further. And in 1999, Columbine had about 1,900 students. So I think that even shows one SRO, one specific body SRO is not effective when you have a population of 1,900 students, let alone that 0.25, because Greeley West High School here in Greeley has 2,000 students and they have 0.25 of an SRO. Now they have security that is hired, but they're not armed. And in fact, in August of 2022, there was a stabbing at one of our high schools.
It was like day 3 of school too, by the way.
The third day of school, tensions are running deep. They didn't realize that kid, they thought it was just a fight. It wasn't until they had scuffled around so much on the ground that they saw blood being smeared that they realized a weapon was involved. And Devin, I think you understand this. You can't ask an unarmed person to get involved in an armed fight. That's, as an employer, that is so irresponsible. You can't, that's not just security at schools, that's security everywhere.
We wouldn't ask a police officer to do that.
Yeah.
We wouldn't ask anybody to do that. That's unreasonable. And really, when it comes down to it, over 92% of crime in the United States is not gun related.
Yep.
It does not involve a gun. So to have SROs who are not armed, I don't think is fair to them either.
I think something else that we need to, maybe take into consideration too is right now the United States has a massive influx of immigrants coming in, whether they're legal or illegal, they're in droves.
They are.
A school in New York closed down for students this week. They had to go on to virtual for the school day because they were trying to house the immigrants in the gym of the school. So we're bringing immigrants into the schools for them to be. Now, do we know that these people are not armed? And so if you're bringing them in, isn't that opening the door for potential weapons to come in?
Well, I think about not only you're letting people in, but they're leaving things behind.
Yeah.
So you don't know what they're leaving behind, and you don't know what a child or a student might get a hold of. And so we're not saying that they're only going to be in a high school level where a child might know what to do with that. You don't know that they're not in an elementary school where a child is curious. I don't know how many times I've had to tell my child, don't pick that up, don't touch that, it's on the ground. She's like, oh look, I'm like, don't touch that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a conversation at 11 years old we still have to have, and it's ridiculous. So, we don't know what they're leaving behind, but, I had heard that there was a lot of frustration with the students because in this New York school, they have to go through metal detectors to come into class and to go through their security to get into the school, whereas everyone who was coming in and staying did not. So there was a lot of frustration being shared amongst these students that they were like, hey, wait a minute, we have to do this, but they don't. And so there was, a lot of that going on. I just don't know when you think about that, like what's being left behind.
Yeah. Going back to what the state of Texas is doing, I think that, as a whole, we need to start thinking about the safety of our children when they are at school. There is a great program here in Colorado called Faster with Laura Carno, and her team help train people inside the school. So it doesn't have to be a teacher. It could be a janitor, a health clerk, something along those lines can be trained on how to diffuse an active shooter situation. Something else that I'm a little concerned about is currently in the state of Colorado, there are no active shooter drill requirements. And that's a very controversial situation because, and Devin, I think you can explain this a lot better, but in order to be able to make sure that you respond in the best way, you can't know that it's coming. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So then what ends up happening is students think that they are truly in an active shooter situation. There was a situation in Fort Collins when they did a drill, and of my babysitters for one of the kids, her granddaughter was going to this school that had the drill, and she started text messaging her grandma, like saying, I love you and goodbye. And that's scary and that's traumatizing, and I get that and I understand that. But if we're not practicing, if we're not training, are we going to be prepared? And what about, just in the aspect of citizens? I mean, a couple of years ago outside of the Walmart, there was two gentlemen who got off of work after working overnight with each other, and they were frustrated, and they decided to have a duel in the Walmart parking lot. Do you guys remember this? So you can't even go to Walmart safely. Like, I think as a society, we need to start to understand that evil is all around us, and the only to win against evil is to be trained up. Obviously trained up in the Lord, but also trained up in self-defense, how to protect yourself. And so shouldn't we be maybe exposing students to active shooter drills so that if they are in some type of a life-threatening situation, they are a little bit more equipped to deal with it? What are your guys' thoughts on that?
Yeah, I forget the acronym, but it's essentially run, hide, or fight. If you can get out of the situation, get out of it. If you can't, hide, and if there's an opportunity to fight.
I remember, I think it was about 2 years ago now, a year ago at least. No, it was 2 years ago. There was a shooting or a threat in a school outside of Detroit. And the kid went to one of the doors and was like, I don't know, let me in, help me, I'm a scared student or something along those lines. And so then, everybody was like, oh my gosh, now our kids are going to have to determine, if who's knocking on the door is, the culprit, or if it's, someone else who's at risk, and should they have to make those decisions. And I mean, we sat down with our kids and had an honest conversation about this. Like, do we like that we're having to have this conversation? No. But I would, and I think you guys would agree, I would rather have these conversations with my kids so that if they are in these situations, they can say, oh, heck no, like, not today. I know what you're up to. I know what your tricks are, and try to, protect themselves and their classmates.
Well, I was thinking about that day I went and picked up the kids, Stacy, and the schools were on lockdown. Do you remember that day?
Yes.
And the SWAT was all over by King Supers, and I had no idea what was going on, and the traffic was backed up, and I texted you, and I'm like, so I'm going to be late picking up the kids because I have no idea what's happening, and their SWAT team with their guns, and I'm going, oh my, what is happening? But it took a little bit for all of us to be notified that the schools were on lockdown. The only reason I knew that they were probably on lockdown is because I saw right in front of my vehicle the SWAT team. So I knew because the schools were directly to my left from the light that I was sitting at. So I knew that they were on lockdown because they would be before notifying all of us. But even on that day at our little kids' school, they do go through some trainings for lockdowns and things like that. But even my daughter told me that the kids in her class were very scared because they didn't understand what was going on. And there was one who was crying and really upset. And afterward, the teacher did debrief with them and said, hey, look, this is how we can't behave like this because it can be a matter of life and death. And I'm grateful that she has those conversations with them because they need to, but it's still the fact that we have to have those conversations. So it's a little bit crazy. So one of the things though that I came across when I was looking at this SRO information though, is that they really discourage for teachers, administrators, janitors, anyone other than an SRO to be armed in a school.
I've met with one of the higher ups of security in Greeley Evans, and when I had asked, what about retired cops, that's stuff like that. Like, what can we do? How can we tap into the community without having to increase funding, kind of a thing, or at least funding to the level that they're talking about? Because, I know that Classical, I don't know if that's Windsor or Loveland or Fort Collins, it's in that weird little triangle area there. They have volunteers that are armed that come, and they have to go through a training. So, why isn't that something that we can implement here? And it was very strongly discouraged to have anybody
but. They have an identification process that when police arrive or an SRO is on, they know they have a certain way that they identify who they are, and, that sort of process. We can have that too. It doesn't have to be, we make it harder than it needs to be. And that's part of the issue, is that we're making things much harder than it needs to be.
I agree, especially considering the fact that, we've touched on this a little bit, schools and maybe law enforcement having a heads up that somebody is making threats or is a little mentally unstable. And one of the things that we have to start to look at is, and I think the Parkland shooting in Florida was definitely an eye-opener in this aspect of, that child was obviously mentally disturbed. When the students said when they heard that there was an active shooter, they knew exactly who it was. But the problem is that the system that is set up inside public education helps protect these children and ties the hands of school administrators and of law enforcement in trying to help remove this from the equation, trying to neutralize the threats before they come to fruition. And there's a really good book out there called Why Did Meadow Have to Die? And it was written by, Meadow was a victim of Parkland, and her dad wrote it, and he talks about the IEP, which is the Individualized Education Plan or program. And so he was on one of those, and it prevented the school from being able to do anything about the threats that he was making, and also was not able to remove him from the school or do anything different with him. I know that we can see in our legislation across the country, not just in Colorado, but across the country, being a criminal is not as punishable as it once was. And that is trickling over into our education system as well. There are kids who are habitual offenders, and if it's a bigger district, they might get danced around to different schools. If it's a smaller district, they might get danced around to different classes, different teachers, to see if somebody can control them. And I just feel like this is perpetuating the issue. We're not addressing the mental health of these students.
No, and I think that DEI plays a huge role in this as well, because we're so focused in on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and including all of these students and saying, I'm not going to single anyone out, when there are times that someone has to be singled out. There are some times that someone needs an intervention. There are some times that those things need to happen, and they're so worried about what that's going to look like to a student populace. Well, you don't need to tell the entire student populace. You just need to individualize with that person. But I think now everybody's so happy and everybody's so crazy, and then they're worried about what parents are going to do and retaliate with that, and that parents are going to come back and say, well, you're singling out my kid. Is it because, and then they're going to find the XYZ to put in there. Is it because they're in the LGBT? Is it because they're black? Is it because they're Hispanic? Is it because they're, whatever the case may be, they're going to find the XYZ to fit in there. Are you singling them out because they're this?
Not that your kid's
Not
crazy.
because, hey, your kid is causing problems. And when it used to be, when the kid was causing trouble, they were kicked out of school. They kept, it was the 3 strikes and you're out kind of a thing, right? Sometimes not even that, depending on whatever the situation was. So we're not doing ourselves any favors by adding this DEI situation. We're not doing ourselves any favors by doing the IEPs. IEPs are fine, but when we're taking them to the extreme that they are, and we're not doing ourselves any favors by inflating information and putting information out there and not putting truth out there and saying, okay, I'm going to take this one study that's out there and call it the truth and use it, and there's this one study out there that's being sort of used as the know-all be-all when it comes to mass shootings, and it's by Adam Lankford, and he's from the University of Alabama, and he said that he included canvassing of 171 nations and all of this information, but he won't even credit his sources. He won't give the information.
Yeah.
And so when someone came back in and redid it, it was actually the NRA, and they want to discredit that because it's the NRA.
Yep.
Even though the NRA came up with different information and they did the same type of study. So you can't do that. You have to give true and honest information. And whether it's one shooting or 500 shootings, none of it's okay. I don't want one, I don't want 500.
Yeah.
So we have to figure out how we have 0.
Yep. Well, and I know that, something that also came out of Parkland shooting was the Claire Davis School Safety Act, which requires the schools to take accountability in some of the aspects. And this actually plays into the Highlands Ranch STEM shooting here in Colorado in 2019, because Kendrick Casteel was the victim that was unfortunately taken from us in that shooting, and the school district kept trying to settle with his parents. They wanted to pay them money when really what they wanted was, they wanted to know the information. They wanted to know what the school knew about it. And the school did not, they would rather just pay out money and say, here's a couple $100,000, go away, instead of to sit down. And so then, from a different aspect, you have to take a look at it and say, okay, that's corporate America, right? That's the lawyers that are coming in and are telling the school, but why wouldn't they want to give out that information? As a taxpayer, I know that the money is coming, it's still essentially from us, because nothing's for free. I know that it doesn't come directly from the taxes that we pay to the school district, whatever they use for settlements. That's why they have insurance. That's through that whole thing. But as a taxpayer, I think that I would rather have the information so that we can learn and grow from the situation, as opposed to just throwing money. Please don't ask any more questions, don't bring it up again. We're not solving any problems that way. That's how this continues to go on. And what kind of a parent goes, who cares that my child's no longer here? I got this nice payout, despite the fact that this school district is still at risk of having an active shooter being protected by the school system.
Yeah. Well, since then, they've been very vocal about being still very pro-gun, right?
Yep.
They're pro-gun, they're pro-Second Amendment, they're very outspoken on that. And I know that the narrative that they tried to use in Colorado was that they were for gun laws and gun reform and those types of things, but they've come out and been like, no.
Yes.
No.
I think, obviously the media is the media, and, they're going to take whatever they want and run with it. They don't care about the ramifications of what they're saying, but I think that is the biggest thing that the media tries to push, and elected officials and non-elected officials that think they have some type of a platform, Reverend Al Sharpton, to talk about this stuff. And that's what they want to perpetuate is, we need to ban guns. Yeah, we need to get rid of it, that the gun's the problem, instead of stopping and taking an honest look at the mental health, how we got to this point. Are we protecting the children? Are we getting them the help that they need? Or are we just trying to hurry up and get them through the 12th grade so we don't have to deal with them anymore?
Yeah.
And I unfortunately think that it's the latter that the school districts are pushing for. Devin, is there anything else that you would like to add in? Maybe some suggestions, some tips for families, how to have them be prepared or to prepare their children?
I would say as a parent, the thought of it sucks, especially going through it. Prepare your kids, but also put them in a school that does value their safety. Because I think if it was truly wanting to keep kids safe, there's enough resources out there that if they wanted to truly keep kids safe, they would use those resources, but choose not to. But prepare your kids the best you can. Talk to them about the realities of the world and what it is.
Is there anything that you would, suggest? I mean, obviously you're going to talk to them about it, but are you just going to give them do you think they should just give them the straight facts of, run, hide, fight? Or do you, kind of talk about hey, it's going to be scary, but, this is how, this is kind of the mind frame you should
I
get
think
in?
Always having those talks with your kids about normal behavior and not normal behavior. The signs stick out like a sore thumb with how people are acting, somebody who's going to do it, and to look for those signs. And obviously, depending on their age, it's going to vary how they take on that information. But sharing that information and reporting it as much as you can.
I know that you did not go into this at all, but, one of the things that you have told me was a lot of your classmates and your peers thought that it was senior pranks at the beginning of Columbine. And you said that you knew immediately that was not the situation. Do you feel like there was something that your parents did to help prepare you for that? Or do you feel like that was just your discernment and...
No, I think I've been around firearms my whole life, and knowing the difference between a gunshot and fireworks. The one thing that completely threw me off was the pipe bombs. I didn't know what a pipe bomb was until hearing them blow up. Would not recommend.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Devin, for coming on and joining us today and giving us some of your expert opinions. Amber, do you have any closing remarks?
I just think that, really, you can't take the media's word for it. So when they're putting information out there, it's always best to go on and do some of your own research too. They're going to give you inflated information and maybe some, information that's been swung a certain way.
Yeah.
And especially when it's centered around mental health, they're not always truthful when it comes to that. They're scrubbing people's social media and they're doing things because they don't, especially if someone's in the LGBT community, they really are, for whatever reason, trying to pull people away from that there's a narrative that these people aren't committing these types of crimes, but they are in fact committing these types of crimes. All people are committing these types of crimes. Anyone with a mental health issue can commit these crimes. It doesn't matter what your sexual preference is. So
I agree. I think in closing, some of my remarks would be just to encourage parents to get to know your school resource officers, your safety department within your school district. Sit down with them, have a conversation, ask them questions. What do you utilize? You know,
how many safety drills do you do?
yeah, even though it's not a requirement in the state of Colorado, do you still do them? How often do you do them? How do you handle mental health? I am able to, see some things on social media, and I think social media, a whole nother episode that we could talk on for hours, but in part of me trying to help protect my children, I'm paying attention to social media to see what other students are doing. And if I see someone that's, kind of an alarming, interactions, things that they post are very strange, I'm bringing that to their attention. Hey, I know that labels me a Karen, and I'm totally fine with that. If that is what is needed to help protect not just my student, even though, that's obviously one of my bigger priorities, but all of the students, because I wouldn't want to know that, someone was acting up. And I know there's a fine line between see something, say something, and all of those things. But when you have a good relationship with them, and when you're willing to sit down and talk with them and not just criticize what they are doing, what they aren't doing, I think that helps improve parents' faith in what their district is doing. So go out there, find out, ask questions, make sure that everybody is, kind of on the same page or telling you answers that you want to hear. Or, if you feel like there's a student that's continuously getting in trouble for the same stuff and it doesn't seem like anything is happening, how do we take that to the next step? Those are the conversations you can have with the security department. Obviously, they can't give you specifics, but they can tell you this is something that you can do to help educate other people, educate the district, inform people of what's going on and what's being said. And then finally, like Devin was saying, just have these conversations with your kids. I am notorious for saying this. I feel like I say it all the time, but when I was a little girl, I remember my parents having a conversation with me about strangers. And if somebody came to school and said, your mom asked me to pick you up, that I was going to need to, we needed to have some type of a way for me to know if that was legit or not. And I feel like just those types of situations keep evolving because as parents, we're preparing our kids, and then the evil people aren't able to, perpetuate their evil doings on kids. And so then they change their approach. And so we are constantly having to do this. And I think that, in 2024, this is what we're having to do now, is to help educate our children, to help them, how can you be strong, for your classmates? How can you be, somebody that they look to be like, okay, they understand what's going on and they've taken some type of authority in terms of hey, I know this is scary, but, screaming and crying right now is not the best option. This is what we got, just those types of things is going to be the best way, because if your kid's the one that tells everybody to be quiet and hide here or whatever, that might mean life or death for all of those kids. And so I think in doing our own part, we should be educating everybody, and then also talking with not just the security staff, but also the educators, the principal, the teachers that you have for your children, just making sure that they have an understanding and they're prepared for some of these things. At the end of the day, they are the ones that are going to potentially be standing between your child and an active shooter.
And I would say, too, understanding what legislation might be coming down the pipeline that will affect this in the schools, because I know there are some things that were passed last year, and there are some things that have been tabled, and they're looking for this year when legislation opens next week.
And then there's some things that, I have in mind that I would like to talk to my elected official for the House of Representatives here in Colorado to help educate of what's going on and like, hey, this is a real need that we have. What can we do from a legislative standpoint? Yep. So, well, thank you guys again so much for joining us for another episode of Schoolhouse Croc. We appreciate you guys. Please feel free to check us out on Twitter or X, whichever one you would like to call it, at Schoolhouse Croc. And also you can contact us by email at Stacey, Stacey, 4D6, that's the number 4, the letter D, and the number 6, at gmail.com. Have a great day. Hello again. I know that we had said goodbye and ended the episode, but while I was editing this episode, a story from Complete Colorado broke that was outlining a draft bill that the Colorado Democratic Representatives has put forward as a potential bill for this year. And I wanted to go over it and add it into this episode because a lot of what it has in it pertains to it. According to the article written by Sherry Pife, this would ban the licensed carrying, so someone who has their concealed carry license, of a concealed handgun in a newly designated sensitive space around Colorado. There are a variety of what they have deemed sensitive spaces, such as a public park or a playground, recreation facility or a community center, any property open to the public while the public is gathering, public or private hospital, nursing home, clinic, medical office, urgent care facility, mental health or substance abuse facilities, a stadium that is host to professional, collegiate, high school, amateur, or student sporting events, any amusement parks, aquariums, carnivals, circuses, fairs, museums, water parks, or zoos, courthouse and other buildings used for court proceedings. It just goes on and on. Pretty much any spaces could be defined as one of these sensitive spaces. One of the other safe spaces is considered to be schools. This bill would potentially repeal legal authority for concealed carry permit holders to have a handgun in the permittee's vehicle on school property and carry a concealed handgun on school property while on duty as a school security officer. So if they take away the ability for school security officers to be able to conceal carry while on campus, it actually affects the program that we talked about in this episode, FASTER, with Laura Carno. And FASTER actually stands for Faculty Administrator Safety Training and Emergency Response. But this would affect that. And we have this bill, it is being sponsored by Senator Sonia Jax Lewis from Boulder County, Senator Chris Kolker of Jefferson Arapahoe County, Senator Tom Sullivan of Arapahoe Douglas County, and Rep. Kyle Brown from Boulder County and Mandy Lindsay, Arapahoe County. When they are trying to take away this access to help us protect our students, we are only going to be opening ourselves up to more opportunities for not necessarily for school shootings, but it just increases the opportunity for damage and loss of life in children if we do not have people who are on campus that can do something to help clear the threat in an active shooter situation. Another Democratic rep that is on board with a lot of these taking away the guns is Rep. Diana DeGette. She definitely pushes for what she claims to be as gun violence prevention task force. And I don't understand how they think that by taking away the opportunity for good people to be carrying guns to help protect and save people
taking that away from people is more important than protecting kids from the bad guys that we know are inevitably going to be around. They always are. And it'll be interesting to kind of keep an eye on this as this legislative session goes on. I will definitely keep you guys posted. Be sure to stay tuned for more episodes of Schoolhouse Croc. Check us out on Twitter and YouTube.